Great. All right. So, as Sarah said, my name is Mike DeBlasi, and I'm the Aquatic Resources Coordinator. I also have Jebra Brown's name on there. She would also be someone that generally deals with planning departments. So, you may see or hear her name if you had something that you wanted to do on your property. I'm with the Oregon Department of State Lands, and one of our tasks is the removal and fill regulatory program. The regulatory statutes have been on the books since the around 1970, and they started out as wetlands only, but they have expanded some years later into waterways as well. Okay, so a lot of people they own their private property and they think, well, this is not state land, so I should be able to do with it what I want. Well, yes, with an asterisk on that. So we have jurisdiction over waters and wetlands in the state, and collectively called waters of the state. And that includes the Pacific Ocean, estuaries, rivers, lakes, streams, wetlands, and ponds. Now, not every stream is going to be considered jurisdictional. If you have an ephemeral stream on your property, it's definitely not jurisdictional. If it's intermittent, it may be. It depends on if it flows to another water and if it would be able to provide food or food and game fish downstream. And then if you have a ditch, sometimes you might have a property that someone 70 years ago created or relocated the stream, and it looks like a ditch, but it's actually the original channel just heavily manipulated. So those would definitely be considered jurisdictional. But if it's a ditch that was dug through wetlands, it would still be jurisdictional. Only roadside ditches and ditches that are dug in uplands would not be considered jurisdictional. And then, of course, we have the wetland jurisdiction. Sometimes people will create ponds. If the pond was created in uplands and is smaller than an acre, it would not be jurisdictional. But if it is larger, it will become jurisdictional. So if you wanted to do some cleaning, perhaps, that might be something where you'd need a permit. Then we have the different waters. Like I said, we have the Pacific Ocean estuaries. Of course, no one here has to worry about that. When you're in streams, if you do something that would be considered below ordinary high water, then that may need some type of permitting from us. If there are no wetlands adjacent to the stream and you're above the ordinary high water, say doing some type of bank protection, then you would not need anything from the Department of State Lands. It's only once you go below that line. And then wetlands, it's to the boundary of the wetland, and it's also essentially to the sky. So the amount of fill that you would be putting in that wetlands would be counted, as I say, up to the sky. Waterways, that's not the case. So we'll get asked occasionally, well, how do you know this is a wetland? So wetlands, we use the Army Corps of Engineers method to determine if a wetland, if an area is a wetland. Then there are regional supplements that are more site specific. We use the Western Mountains, Valley and Coast, and the Arid West. Around here, it would be the former. And wetlands are going to be areas that are saturated by surface or groundwater long enough and more and often enough that will support a certain type of vegetation, and it will create conditions in that soil. I don't know how many folks are familiar with soils, but when you dig within a wetland, you're going to see certain characteristics in the soil that you would not see in an upland. So it's what we like to call a three-legged stool. that creates a wetland. You have wetland plants, wetland hydrology, and wetland soils. The hydrology is going to be the driver of it. The presence, as I said, and the duration of saturation will create conditions within the soil, which can then support those plants. And if you look in the picture to the right, you can see that the soil color from going down from the vegetation line down, you see it, you have some rust looking spots. That's iron that's been rusted. It was mobilized in water, and then when the water drops, it rusts. And then as you go down, you see a lighter gray and then darker gray, and those are form under conditions of longer term saturation. So wetland plants are also called hydrophytes. They're going to be plants that grow very well in these saturated low oxygen soils. Sometimes they're going, in the previous conversation we had, sometimes we have native and then you have non-native. Some soil, some vegetation can be non-native, or even a crop, say like a fescue, that grows well in wetlands. It just grows well in a certain time of year when they're not saturated. But within the hydrophytes, you'll have plants that are guaranteed to only see in wetlands. Then you'll see some that are generally found in wetlands, some that are generally found in uplands, and then species that are clearly upland species. So just looking at the vegetation will give you a clue, at least, is this definitely upland or is this definitely a wetland? So some examples I have. So for the herbaceous species, you have cattails, sedges, rushes. Then for shrubs, willows, spirea, red osier, dogwood. And then for trees, you'll have the black cottonwood, the Oregon ash. And then, especially as you get to the coast, you'll see more of that cedar and spruce. So as I said, the hydrology is what drives it all. So the term wetland hydrology, it's going to encompass all the characteristics of the hydrology in an area. So it's how long is it inundated? Where's the source of the water? Is it going to be groundwater dominate, runoff dominated, or some type of floodplain wetland? And then when we're someone who knows what they're doing, going out to look for a wetland, they're going to be looking for primary indicators or secondary indicators. And you can see I have the list there. You may or may not see more than one, but especially if you are in an area that's kind of problematic, if you find more of these, it's going to help kick you over into claiming it's a wetland or not. And then the soils. Soils are called hydric soils when they're in wetlands. And a hydric soil definition is a soil that's saturated or flooded long enough during the growing season that it will develop anaerobic conditions, and that will favor the growth of hydrophytic vegetation. And it'll also favor certain microbacteria in the soils. And the chemistry that will happen within the soil is really bacterial metabolism. So when a soil is saturated long enough, it loses the oxygen within that soil. And so the bacteria will have to use different other elements to metabolize to survive. And in that picture, you can see again, you have those orangish red sections, and that's where the iron has collected, and when the water goes down, it rusts. Certain soils, you'll see a whole slew of it in the soil. Others you'll just see along the roots, because that's really the only place where oxygen is coming down into the soil. And then if it's something that's saturated for a longer time or permanently saturated, it'll get almost that clayey, slick texture and color to it. And so for colors, we use what's called the Munsell Soil Color Book. And by having this book, it helps kind of create a common language of what color the soil is, and then certain colors will be what you would expect to see in a wetland. So you do have to have all three criteria to be called a wetland. Certain areas are what's called problematic. So in a farm field that's wetland, generally the native vegetation is gone, but at least, as I said, there'll be certain vegetation planted for a crop that would favor wetter conditions. Or you could have conditions where someone has come in and manipulated the topsoil, and so what you'd expect to see in that top layer of soil in a wetland has been removed. And next question, are wetlands always wet with saturated soils? It's a frequent conversation I have. People will say, well, it's not wet all year long, or I'm not seeing any surface water like ponded. Well, wetlands are generally seasonal. Though obviously on the coast and in heavy, very wet areas, that season could be longer than what we would have in the valley. But at least here, you will see wetlands that are going to be wet this time of year, probably into the spring, depending on where you are, into June. And then they'll dry out, and you'll think, well, I can drive on it, I can grow a crop in it, it can't be wetland. So to help you, there's a couple of sources of information. There's the National Wild Wetland Inventory, and that's done by the Fish and Wildlife Service. Consider that like the 50,000 foot level scale best guess if there's wetlands. They're better in open areas. Forested areas are not as good, easy to tell. Some cities will have local wetland inventories, and that's a closer best guess. Sometimes there'll be specific on-site information collected, but it really depends on if property owners would give permission, and if not, if they had permission on one lot but not the other, they might look over the fence line and say, it's same soil type, same vegetation, we'll just assume it's a potential wetland over there too. The Web Soil Survey, you can access that from the NRCS. It will, if you go to your own property, it will tell you the soils there, and it will explain the level of hydric conditions. A soil can be considered hydric from anywhere from 30% to 100%. And what that means is the lower the percentage, it's much more of a mixture. So you may have a 30% chance of finding hydric soils in that soil unit versus 100, where it would be assumed it's going to be 100. Like the wetland inventory, though, it's going to be a very high level best guess. It's not going to be as accurate as if someone came to your property and did the look themselves. So one thing I hadn't said in those was the statewide wetland inventory, and that's something that we created and put out last year, and you can find that on our website as well. And what it does, it takes the national wetland inventory information. It will show you the study areas of any local wetland inventories. It will show the stream layer, and then it will take what the hydric soil mapping. And there's the two subsets are those that are over 50%, and then the one for Jackson County. So of course that one isn't relevant for our area. But again, it's a good way to filter out and to see where there's a higher likelihood of being wetlands on your property. And of course, the next step would be either, if you had a plan, to hire a consultant or to give us a call, and we might have a little better information. So this is what you'd be seeing if you go to that the statewide wetland inventory. It's going to show these are farmed wetlands. Generally, they're not shown on the National Wetland Inventory. This is an area down by the Corvallis Airport. It's got the National Wetland Area that's in the green. The local wetland inventory area is in the blue. And then that brownish color is what's called hydric soil. So you see they don't really all cover the same exact area. And it's in those areas where you're not seeing overlap that you'd really want to investigate further. And here's another one. This is by Harrisburg. Again, the local wetland inventory, it detects areas that are predominantly hydric, but if you're looking at the green areas, it doesn't cover those at all. So again, it's one of those things that you'd like to really get more local on-site information. So another question I get is, how do I find out if I have a wetland on my property? And then people may have heard the word delineation. So there's a difference between a wetland determination and a wetland delineation. Determinations are always going to be a lot broader, usually with a lot less information. And it's going to be looking at those mapping sources and any other information that we may have, just to give you a sense. Yeah, you have, it looks like you have wetlands on your property, but it won't tell you the extent, and maybe not even can tell you where. The delineation is where you hire a consultant to come in, and they will do soil pits throughout the property. They'll look at the vegetation, and depending on the site, there may need to be groundwater monitoring, but generally that's for really confusing sites. So a determination, you can call us up and we can do what's called an offsite. It might take a few weeks before you get an answer, but the answer is not going to be very conclusive. It may just be, we think there's wetlands on your property and that we recommend a delineation. Whereas the on-site determination, if we have time, we could come in and take a look, maybe do a soil pit or two, but again, not really getting a sense of where the wetlands are on your property to the full extent. So you'd want to hire a consultant to do the real on-site investigation. And the Society of Wetland Scientists has a professional wetland list. We can't recommend anyone in particular. You can ask us, I guess what you call their success rate of delineations. We even have what's called a scorecard on our website, but we couldn't say if you want to avoid someone or not. So what if you do have wetlands on your property and you want to do something? So generally, if you're away from what's called essential salmonid habitat, it's a 50 cubic yard threshold, and it's additive. So if you were going to do some removal and some fill, you would have to add it up to see how much that is. And again, that's the work that goes on in wetlands. Now, every year, that 50 cubic yards is sort of renewed, but the removal is generally is basically an annual allowance, whereas if you did 10 cubic yards of fill in a wetland in year one, the next year you could do only at most 40, and then it keeps shrinking down. So here, where I said that it's 50 cubic yards, so if you have an essential salmonid habitat waterway that goes through your property, and that waterway can access the wetlands, there's say not a levee or something, then those wetlands will become part of that 0 cubic yard threshold. Now, some activities may be exempt. So if you have forest land that you manage for commercially managed, and you're just following the State Forest Management Practices Act, then you can generally do things that will not need a permit, and that can include road construction. Now, you still have to follow the practices statute and rules, but generally we have a hands off on that. Now, I doubt any of you have hydroelectric dams on your property, but that would again be one of those exemptions. Navigational servitude, I doubt there'll be any issues here. But I'll bet you have a culvert on your property, or some maybe tile drain, or even riprap. If you're maintaining that water control structure, as we call them, and you're just staying within the same footprint, then that would be an exempt activity. If you had a road or other transportation structure that needed to be emergency reconstruction on it, again, that would be an exempt activity, providing you stay within the original footprint. I don't expect much prospecting to be going on around here. If you were going to do something that would be an improvement for fish passage or fish screening, that's exempt, even if it's an ESH. And if you had to change your point of diversion for your surface water. Now, if you want to do some habitat restoration, and the key is voluntary, so it's not, say you're being told by DEQ or some other agency, and you also can't be using money from BPA, because when they give money for habitat restoration, that's their mitigation for the impacts of their operations. But if you wanted to do planting, you can do that, no problem. If you had some ditch or tile drain that you wanted to remove, again, you can do that even in wetlands. If you wanted to do some placement of wood or boulders in your creek, if you have one. And then if you, of course, were removing garbage or other debris from a wetland or waterway. Now, here's where probably most of you are interested in the exemptions for agricultural activities. What we've done is allowed certain activities that are on farm zoned land that are general normal farming practices within those wetlands and waterways, then you can continue doing them. Now, the caveat to that is that it has to have been regularly farmed land. So if it hasn't been farmed in 10 years, or there was, it's grown up to be a shrubby forested area and you want to bring it back into production, then that exemption is severed. And so you'd have to come in to do whatever you want to do through a permit. We have ag ditch maintenance, and it's used to be under a general permit specifically for that. Some of you may have heard that the legislature passed a bill. I can't remember which session it was. It was very recent, though. That basically takes, if you're in the dry and you want to do some cleaning in a jurisdictional stream or ditch, you can go through the Department of Agriculture. If it's something that's in the wet, you would still have to come through us. Now, if you want to restore a wetland, that'd be great. And of course, if you're in the class, you may already know why. We've lost a whole lot of wetlands in our state. and even worse in the Willamette Valley. And the wetlands have been degraded, those that are still here, by water regime that's been changed from damming or some other manipulation to the hydrology through pollution and, of course, invasives. Now, these wetlands are very important ecologically. They provide the habitat for fish, amphibians, birds, or they provide pathways. So 24% of the wetland-dependent amphibians are ranked as imperiled, and there's been extensive modification to our streams, rivers, and wetlands. So any little bit that we can get restored is definitely a plus. Some of you perhaps may be adjacent to a waterway that is what's called state-owned land. Most waterways in the state have not been determined state-owned bed and banks because there haven't been navigation studies. But those that have, I know the Willamette, I think part of the Santiam, have, and so the state owns the bed and banks. Other than that, then the private adjacent landowners would be the owner. If there's a meandered lake on your property, probably not, but if there is, that would be something that we own. And then, of course, the territorial sea. And then we also own uplands in the east side, but again, that's not a big deal to you. But if you do have property that has a state-owned land or water adjacent to it, and you are going to do something within that, you would not only need to come to us for a removal fill permit, but you'd also have to come through the other Department of State lands subdivision that's called the proprietary. And basically you're getting an easement perhaps, or some type of lease to put something out there. So, and here's an example. If you had a dock on the river, or say you have some type of water pump dock that's just to put the water pump out in the summer for your irrigation, and it is on a state-owned water, then you would have to get some type of registration for that. So in summary, what you want to know if you need a permit or not, is it in waters of the state? So is it in a jurisdictional water? Is it something that's regulated, or could it be an exempt activity? And if it is regulated, does the work you want to do exceed the 50 cubic yards or 0 in the ESH waterways? So if you have any questions, and you may, you can call us at the main number right there. Obviously with COVID, our in-office staff is pretty thin, but if you call, they can direct you to the correct resource coordinator, and they can get back to you. And then you can also talk to the proprietary coordinator if you need some type of property permission agreement. And down there is Carrie Landrum's name. She'll be the one that you would talk to for Marion County.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike. That was fantastic. Full of tons of information. I do want to point out that in the technical sheets that you received, we do have a question about whether you're along an ESH, Essential Salmon Habitat stream. So you should be able to find that information in there. We also use the National Wetlands Mapper to figure out whether, according to the National Wetlands Mapper, you have wetlands on your property. But again, that's at the, what did you say, 50,000 foot level?
Yeah, it's a very coarse scale.
Which means that it can point you to the potential of having wetlands, but it actually isn't a deciding, it's not the decisive way that you find out if you have wetlands.
Correct. Yeah, it's a good first filter.
Right. And so we do have a question. Paul asks if there are grant funds available for restoration of wetlands, perhaps for benefit of specific riparian or amphibian species.
So we don't do grants in, say, like the OWEB way or some other, maybe even soil and water district. But what we do have, and I have to claim ignorance on how it works, is with the mitigation, when someone does an impact to wetlands, they have to mitigate for it. There are several options, and one of them is going into the payment in lieu mitigation. And what that means is basically you're paying us, and it goes into this account that would then be used for mitigation of wetlands within that general service area. I don't manage that. Dana Field in our office is the one that manages it, and I don't know how the process is to release money on that. It's not our favorite way of mitigating for impacts to wetlands, because then it puts the onus on us to find good projects and fund them.
I can add to that a little bit. The Soil and Water Conservation District has landowner assistance program grants. There may also be some OWEB, Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board grants available at some point in time in the future. But the landowner assistance program grants can assist with the restoration of wetlands. We can talk more about that. Again, I highly recommend having us out for a site visit. Contact me and let me know via email what you're interested in so that I can set you up with the right person from our office to talk to you. So as Jenny said, we have some folks that do ag and some folks that do natural areas. And so we want to set you up with the person that can help you the most. And so if you just send me an email, let me know what you're interested in, then I can forward your information to the right person in our office, and we can set you up with a site visit. And that would be your first step towards grant funds available through the district. And our folks may be able to point you to grant funds available through other organizations. Are there any other questions on wetlands and waters of the state and permitting?
I do have a comment that I didn't say earlier. So sometimes people will have the NRCS come out to look if there are wetlands. And I said earlier that we use the Corps of Engineers method, and there's not a complete overlap. So there have been instances where the NRCS says there aren't wetlands, and we come out, and based on the way we do it, we do find wetlands. So I would default to calling us or the Corps of Engineers rather than sticking just with the NRCS says.
This is Jenny. I have a question for Mike. Regarding the removal fill limit of 50 cubic yards, is there a stream reach length for that 50 cubic yards, or is it per property? How do you determine what area that covers?
So it's going to be per project. So it
Okay.
could go across tax lot lines. But that reminds me, that ODA, the new ODA program, the way the general permit had worked, it was you would get up to 100 cubic yards of removal and 100 cubic yards of fill before you kicked over into the regular permit. With the new ODA permit or system, you have, gosh, I think it's like 3,000 cubic yards over a mile's length of stream.
Right, that sounds about right.
Yeah, which that's a lot of material. So it only be once you kick past that you'd then come back to DSL.
Right, and that's just for the drainage ditches, though, not for streams.
It is for dry streams.